States. Today we'll be having a conversation with Howie Hawkins to present questions posed by members of the Young Ecosocialist Caucus to our party's presidential candidates. All right, so our first question is, in light of this pandemic urging us to adopt internationalist approaches to crises, how are you going to develop cooperative schemes with other governments beyond trade? And how are you going to protect workers both inside and outside the U.S. through these alliances without picking sides between rival nations?
Well, I want to withdraw the economic sanctions. I know that gets to trade, but that's punishment that shouldn't be going on, especially in this crisis. We want to have a global Green New Deal where we help these countries not only deal with the health, but also the economic consequences of this pandemic and the lockdowns. And then we want open borders so that workers can organize across borders and not let those borders divide and conquer us. For example, in Mexico, the low wages there, the real threat is not people coming here and taking jobs. The real threat is they use low wages in Mexico as a hammer against workers in this country and threaten them. If you don't concede to our demands, that's the employer demands, we're going to Mexico.
It's a very interesting answer, Howie. So sort of picking up off of that thread, one of the big principles of the Green Party is sort of decentralizing power and trying to upend the hierarchical systems that dominate the current world. One of our members wanted to ask, what steps is your administration going to take to ensure the self-determination of indigenous peoples and promote decolonization within the United States?
Well, we have 370 treaties with American Indians that we violated, so we need to honor those. And that's both services that are supposed to be provided that have not, and land that has been stolen that needs to be returned. In addition, we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which conferred land rights to Mexican Americans that have been violated, and that's still in dispute in the courts. That's something we should honor. And then we have the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, which conferred land rights to Native Hawaiians in Hawaii. I have 4 cousins over there, and it's a real scandal that they keep taking Hawaiian lands for the tourism industry and real estate developers. So, we got to honor the commitments we've made. That's the first step.
Yeah. So sort of moving on to a little bit of a different topic, what is your COVID-19 response plan going to do for renters and the unhoused community in the United States?
Well, we need a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, including homeowners here. We need to cancel the obligation of homeowners and renters to pay their mortgages and rents for the duration and have the federal government pay those. Second part of that is important because if that money's not paid, everything from your local credit union to bigger banks, landlords, all the businesses that depend on property management are not going to have the cash flow they need to stay in business. So you're going to have dominoes. You're going to make the depression worse than it is. Ilhan Omar had a bill that would just do this. Of course, Pelosi didn't include it in her so-called HEROES Act, which I call the Cowards Act. And so, at best, we've got in some states and federally a postponement of rent. And then when it comes due, people are not going to be able to pay it. So that's a big problem. The other good thing about Omar's bill is that when people want to sell rental properties, they have to notify HUD. And HUD notifies local public housing authorities and nonprofits, and they have the first option to buy, which means we can increase the amount of housing in the public and nonprofit sectors to increase affordable housing. So that should have been done. And then to house the unhoused, this Defense Production Act provides the capacity and authority for the federal government to commandeer hotels and unoccupied homes to house the homeless. And also, we need to release the migrants from those detention camps, those that are camped out on the Mexican border because Trump won't let them in to, go through due process. And we should provide them with homes as well. And the Defense Production Act gives the president the authority in this crisis to do that. And it's not just a homeless issue, it's a public health issue.
Yeah, I think that those are very interesting answers. I really like the comprehensive steps that you laid out to address the housing crisis as a sort of fundamental root of this, of why the COVID-19 crisis has taken such a scale in the United States relative to the rest of the world. So I think that's very interesting. Moving forward to some youth-specific issues, what will your administration and campaign do to ensure that adopted children have the same access to their original birth certificates that other folks do?
Well, we need federal legislation to ensure that adoptees do have access to those original birth certificates. That's something we successfully advocated for in New York, and it became law, I guess 2018 or 2019, I think it became law. But we did get that passed in New York, and it's something we need to do at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A 2012 study by the National Council on Disability found that parents with disabilities are more likely to lose custody of their children after divorce and face significant barriers to adopting children. What does your administration intend to do to change this?
Well, the U.S. signed several years ago the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which does provide some protection for parents with disabilities. We should get that ratified by the Senate and then follow it up with legislation to implement those rights and make them enforceable in the United States.
Interesting. So the Young Ecosocialist Caucus is a safe haven for a lot of queer and neurodiverse political activists, especially within the Green Party and within the American political space generally. So one of the issues that really matters to us is conversion therapy. What would your administration do about the continued prevalence of conversion therapy in the United States, including treatments inflicted on both queer and autistic people in the forms of gay conversion therapy and applied behavioral analysis?
Well, there's legislation before Congress called the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act that would ban this conversion therapy. So we need to pass that. That's something we worked on in New York successfully, and it became law January of this year. So I think that's what you got to ban it.
Sounds very good. One of the biggest debates in the Green Party today is the question of the rights of sex workers. So the Young Ecosocialist political line on this question is pretty unambiguous. We believe that sex work is work, and the rights of these workers ought to be protected by the state. Regarding sex workers' rights, the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, FOSTA and SESTA, were intended by lawmakers to protect sex workers on the internet by vastly limiting their capacity to work over the internet. However, advocates of sex workers' rights and activists within the community have pointed out that limiting their capacity to do work online would simply make this work more dangerous. Do you support the federal decriminalization of sex work and the repeal of FOSTA-SESTA?
Well, yes and yes. And the decriminalization, I think the New Zealand model is much better than the so-called Nordic model in Sweden because it only decriminalizes half of the transaction in the Nordic model, which keeps law enforcement involved, and they go after the payors. But the payee, the person that receives the funds, is part of that transaction, and they get caught up in the criminal justice system, and this should not be another pipeline for mass incarceration. I think also when we decriminalize, we should have a ban on corporate brothels, and the only kind of brothels you can have are worker-owned cooperatives, so that people can manage their own conditions of work and get their fair share of the net income of the business. And then, legalization like they have in Nevada and some of the European countries brings in a lot of regulation, sort of creates a shadow criminalization, because if you don't meet all the standards and regulations, and it's very limiting to where you can practice your trade. you get criminalized. So that is not a good model either.
It's great to have a straightforward answer on that. I know a lot of our members were very anxious to hear what your response would be. Okay, moving along. Among the greatest technological issues of our time is the influx of artificial intelligence technologies into the hands of private corporations for marketing and logistics, as well as governments for the enforcement of their existing laws. To what extent should enforcement of online communication laws, especially the Communication Decency Act, be done through computer-controlled algorithms?
You know, I want to pardon Edward Snowden because he did a great public service. And I read his book, what's it called? Oh, I'm blanking on it right now. What's it called?
Permanent Record?
Permanent Record, thank you.
Starting
it was
on
a
it
real
right
page. Oh, you're reading it right now?
Yeah, I'm getting started on it.
Be careful, because once you start, you won't be able to stop, and you won't get anything else done until you're done. That is a great book. It's both, you know, a great story about how he decided what he came to do, and also about policy. And I think he has a good sense of how to balance our privacy rights, our other constitutional rights, with the need to collect legitimate intelligence. Like, where did the coronavirus come from, and when's it, you know, early warning about it coming. So I'm not an expert in this field, but I would bring people like him into the administration. And I would ask him, if I was president, to take a role in the administration and help us formulate policy on these questions. So the other thing, one thing he mentions in that book is that your information that's online is your property. Those who collect it, whether they're government or corporate, should not have control over that. And they have that right in the EU. We should have that right in this country.
Moving to another topic regarding the internet. Currently, a lot of millennials and Gen Zers have sort of come to their political awakenings over the internet, whether it came through online forums or just, you know, finding the writings of Marx and whomever online. What is your campaign going to do to make disenfranchised social media savvy radicals and internet leftists feel like they have a home in the Green Party?
Well, I'm certainly inviting them into my campaign. I am kind of old school. I like books. You can see in the background, I like books.
Me too.
I'm still, you know, like this platform, you know, it's the first time I ever use this platform on right now. And I know that form of communication, particularly with younger folks, is how they find out what's going on. So I think it's very important. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, they are welcome and they're needed, because us old farts don't know how to do a lot of this stuff, and we need help.
Right. Young people feel increasingly disenfranchised and demoralized of the idea that any political movement could meaningfully and positively change their lives, whether it's coming from a sort of decentralized movement like Occupy Wall Street or from a robust political party like the Greens. How will you be an active champion for young people, encouraging them to become politically more active while also appealing to, you know, the older folks who make up the majority of voters in the United States?
Well, I was young at a time when we had a slogan that was first made as a joke in the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964. And it said, "Don't trust anybody over 30. And a lot of us took it up because we didn't get listened to. And, you know, that was my experience. Even, you know, I was one of the founders of the Clamshell Alliance. I was like the baby. And these older folks, you know, we'd be speaking and I'd say something, and then people go on like I'd never said what I said. So I think the older folks have got to make room for the younger folks and listen and, you know, respect their contributions. And I would say to young people that may feel demoralized or feel it's hopeless, two things. One is you got to be part of an organized group locally. You got to have other people to share the trials and tribulations and the victories and successes together. Also, that will help you sharpen your understanding, and not just, you know, if everybody's online, you get in your silos and you're just getting reinforced. It's good to, you know, get other opinions. That also means going out and talking to people that are not in your usual circles, grassroots organizing, listening to people, not just going out and preaching. And the other thing I would say is, study history. Because if you look at social movements and how change comes, a lot of times, and I've had this experience many times, you're in the minority, you're vilified. And actually you're changing minds and you don't even know it. And then suddenly it's like that door that was jammed, you break through, and everybody around you that wasn't with you comes running through with you and said, we're with you all the time. And so I think you got to understand that. And, if you're confident about your position, realize that even if people aren't acknowledging it, you're changing minds. I'll just give one example. Vietnam War, 66, 67, we were vilified. 65, that's when the escalation began. We were soft on communism, blah, blah, blah. And then, a lot of the older people's sons were coming back, if not dead or wounded, mentally wounded. And they began to question what was going on. And after the Tet Offensive, when Cronkite said, we're not going to win this war, which the leaders of the country already knew, I saw people flip. I mean, I came up to the community with a lot of auto workers, and they were very patriotic, a lot of World War II veterans. And they were all for the war until, just like groupthink, they all just flipped, early in 68, and they're all against the war. And, I've seen that happen again and again. So I would say to young folks, just keep pushing, be part of a group, study history, and realize that progress comes in leaps. It's not like gradual, orderly. It's like you leap because suddenly things flip and you break through.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. In evolutionary biology, we call that punctuated equilibrium, sort of moments of stasis punctuated by large jumps. So I think that's a very interesting and good point.
Yeah, and social systems are a lot like ecological systems. And, when new niches develop, punctuated, what'd you call it? Equilibrium, punctuated evolution, whatever.
Punctuated equilibrium.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good analogy.
Yeah, well, ecological wisdom. All right, so this is actually my own question, so I'm very interested in your response to it. Within the decentralized framework of the Green Party, which emphasizes decentralization and grassroots democracy, what is your strategy to lead the party as the presidential nominee and the figurehead with respect to its broad national goals and to resolving the varying priorities of the state parties, locals, and political factions within the party?
Well, I call it democratic decentralism as opposed to democratic centralism, the old Leninist party model where once the majority decides on a line, everybody's got to follow it, which in my opinion limits who can come in, leads to splits, and is not a way of building a mass party for social change. So we need to, majority position carries the national party position, but we should allow people that don't agree. They don't have to carry out the line. They can continue the discussion. And sometimes minorities in the end, win over everybody. So that's important. So the discussion continues and we remain unified. Now, the thing I'm emphasizing in my campaign is that, we're not going to become a major party through a national campaign around a celebrity or a big vote in one election. We got to organize a grassroots base. And that means the most important thing is to build our locals. And we need to organize locals in the communities that vote in low numbers. There are 100 million people probably won't vote in this election that could. And those are predominantly working class, people of color, and young people. And we won't get them disalienated, because that's what they are. People say they're apathetic. I think more of them are alienated because they don't trust either of the two parties. They don't think the political system is responsive, knows what their problems are, knows who they are, and they've just said, I'm not going to participate. But when we have Green Party chapters in their communities where they know us, they have relationships with us, they trust us, then, and we can, make changes at the local level, even small changes, gives people confidence that we can make bigger change. That's what we've got to emphasize. And so when we talk about decentralized, I don't think it means everybody for themselves. It means bottom-up coordination. So, the power and the decision-making starts at the bottom, but we come to agreement for the broader social goals from the bottom up. So I think we both need a strong center that can support the local organizing with field organizing. And we need to raise money so that we can do that. But the priority is not the presidential election or big races like Senate and governor. Those are important sometimes to get ballot lines, and we got to do it. That, to me, is the biggest reason to run in this race, because about 40 of the states, the vote we get in the presidential election determines whether we'll have a ballot line for the next election cycle. But that enables us to do the local organizing, and that's how we're going to build ourselves into a major party from the bottom up. So I don't think it's either or. The relationship should be bottom up coordination, not top down.
Yeah, that sort of reminds me a lot of going back to Lenin, his idea of dual power, that you have to have a sort of an organization that's capable of conveying the interests of the workers and the grassroots up to a larger mass movement that can still exercise power. So I think that's a very interesting idea. So one of our members wanted to ask, what is your position on establishing the federal level cabinet recommended by former Democratic presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, the Department of Peace? And sort of to expand on this question a little bit, how would you use the potentially a Department of Peace, but also the Department of Defense and State in order to implement a green foreign policy?
Well, it all depends on the policies you put into the Department of Peace. We have a U.S. Peace Institute, which is an auxiliary of our foreign policy, which is very imperialistic. So just to change the labels doesn't necessarily mean you're going to change the substance. The important thing is that we should scale back radically our military footprint, calling for a 75% cut in military spending, withdrawal from these 7 endless wars, from our over 800 foreign military bases, bring the troops home, set up our force structures for defense of our own territory, not being the world's global military empire. And let's instead be the world's humanitarian superpower through a global Green New Deal that's multilateral. And we help the global South and other countries that are like, petrostates like Russia, leap out of the 19th century fossil fuel technology into the 21st century solar technology, and also provide the basic social supports. For a fraction of our military budget, we could provide everybody in the world who doesn't have access now to clean water, elementary education, basic health care. And that would do more to promote peace than, all the weapons we've got. So I think that's the basic approach. Department of Peace that might, lead that effort. It's just a matter of, what agencies you do it through. We do have the State Department, which is supposed to do diplomacy. You do have, when I was in the Marine Corps, they wanted me to become what they called a civil affairs officer. So I was the one that went in to win hearts and minds after the land was taken. And you had to understand the people and that kind of thing. And that has a role in peacekeeping. But it's different, like, that was Vietnam era. So, we blow up a village and we come in with a civil affairs officer to say, we're really on your side. Tough thing to do. On the other hand, you send in a peacekeeping force from the UN to deal with the aftermath of a genocide or a catastrophe. You need those kind of people with those skills. So that's what I think. It's the substance, not the labeling, that matters the most.
Yeah, and I would like to sort of push into that vein a little bit more, because one of the things that drove me to the Green Party and to your campaign relative to the Sanders campaign and the Sanders movement was that I perceived a sort of difference between the foreign policy of even the people on the furthest to the left of the Democratic Party. I'm sort of thinking about Tulsi Gabbard's, we need to end regime change wars, but, being a hawk on the war on terror and stuff like that. And you mentioned that, we need to be a humanitarian power in the world. That admittedly reminded me a little bit of the Obama doctrine and Samantha Power's humanitarian interventionist stance. So I would like to sort of ask for a bit of a clarification on what, I guess, really addressing people coming out of the Sanders campaign, what would differentiate the green foreign policy from Bernie, Tulsi, these other left-leaning Democratic contenders?
Well, every imperialist uses humanitarian rhetoric to justify their intervention. Hitler did it when he went into Czechoslovakia. So again, it's not the label, it's the substance. And when I say humanitarian superpower, I mean we're helping people deal with their energy problems and their basic human needs problems. And look, there are cases of genocide, countries crossing borders to take over other countries. And through the UN Security Council, as problematic as it is, there are times when we should intervene. And I would say the U.S., without intending to, has done a couple of those things recently. You know, they saved the Yazidis from genocide by providing, this was the Marine Corps, providing air support and intelligence to the PYD militia of the Syrian Kurds. And they saved those people who ISIS, they wanted to kill all the men and boys and enslave the women as sex slaves. And so they also saved the city of Kobani in Kurdish Syria from being run over by ISIS. Now, the U.S. didn't do that for humanitarian reasons because they really didn't care about the Kurds, and we dumped them again. So it was more like incidental that it happened. But the point is, you know, those were good results in those two cases. You know, if the international community wanted to stop what's happening, say, to the Rohingya, you know, in Burma, in India, or Bangladesh now, you know, that's something worth looking at. Now, to defend those people would be humanitarian, you know, but you could also go in there and use them as an excuse to, you know, decide who's going to rule Burma or Bangladesh or India, and that wouldn't be proper. So again, it's the substance, not the label, that counts the most.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that clarification. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. All right, so we've come down to our last question. This, as somebody, as an undergraduate working in science, I'm particularly interested in your response to this, because I hope it can sort of cast some nuance on a debate that has existed within the Green Party for a while regarding science. So our generation has grown up watching private companies like SpaceX and Monsanto soar past the federal government in their capacity to find path-breaking research in space exploration and biotechnology. Especially with regard to Monsanto, the instrumentalization of these technologies to the detriment of workers and the environment has inspired a renewed distrust of science generally. What's your position on increasing NASA funding, as well as the funding of the NIH and other public scientific institutions? And what would be the place of these public institutions with regard to these large, you know, powerful corporate science institutions?
I think we should reinforce public investment in science, and what's created with those public investments, the patents should be, you know, that's humanity's common inheritance. And what the private sector does is try to get, you know, this intellectual property protected so they can monopolize and, you know, get monopoly rents for the use of that property, which is a big contributor to growing inequality and limiting access. I remember during the Clinton-Gore administration, they were protecting, I forget the company, but one of the big pharma companies had an AIDS drug, and they wouldn't let it just go to Africa because it was needed. They wanted to make sure that that company, you know, maximized the income. Even if their people couldn't pay for it there, they'd rather sell it at a higher price than have people get the treatment. And as far as NASA, I always say NASA, I think it should be funded. I think exploring space is something that, rather than being privatized, should be internationalized and have much more cooperation among the nations of the world. This Space Force is a disaster. NASA has a basic secret military budget. And I heard a story yesterday. They just launched a rocket, and the story was that the secret agency had two Hubble telescopes that they've been, instead of looking out into space, been using to spy on the world. And then they found something better, and they had these two extra Hubble telescopes. And so they told the public NASA that you want them. And the head of NASA didn't even know they had that. The secret NASA had it. I mean, that's insane. And militarizing space is a real threat. So I'm for scientific inquiry with public investment, with the results being public. and reducing to a great extent all the secret things that the government does. A lot of it doesn't need to be secret. And again, somebody like Edward Snowden in my administration would help me, parse out what really does need to remain a secret and what can be public.
All right. Well, that's all the questions that I have for you, Howie. Thank you very much for speaking with us. It was a wonderful experience on my part to be able to talk with you and present the issues that my caucus cares about to you.